Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream event on the 6th of July, 2021. I got the date right. Whoopee. Great to have you on board tonight, and thanks very much for spending some time with me tonight. It's going to be an interesting conversation because I've got a lot of material to go through tonight, particularly around what the Reserve Bank said today, as well as my stress data. So there's a lot to get into. I will just acknowledge a few comments and things in the chat though, because there's some quite funny things going on. Let's go with Vanessa's. Where are the puppies? The puppies are up stowed, so they hopefully won't visit tonight. We hope. They're going. I took them out for a long walk, and then they ran around the garden for half an hour. So it's pretty good. Aussie Jean says cardigan and beanie. Yeah, it was a bit cool tonight when I went out, but not too bad. Vanessa says it's cold. Yeah. What the world. Yeah, thank you, Cookie. Great to see you all on board. I won't go through the all the things. New Logic spotted the Stream Deck. Yeah, I've got a couple of Stream Decks that I use to control the system. Probably I should do a more detailed show at some point about the way that the studio is actually set up, because I have quite a few people ask, but I don't want to deflect from the main purpose of the show tonight. But I will do it at some point because this is quite interesting. I'm actually quite pleased now with how it's set up and how it's working and all the stuff I've done. Anyway, what we should now do is we should get on with the show. And for this part of the show, as you may remember, I tend to go through a few slides to start with. I'm going to do that. And during that time, I won't really be looking at the chat. So if you've got questions for me, hold off at the moment. As soon as I've gone through this part of the conversation, then what we'll do is we'll go through the questions. Of course, I want to spend quite a lot of time in the show with questions, but nevertheless, let's just look at the... Cookie Boy said, why are you so grumpy? Well, the reason I'm grumpy in that slide was because I did this just after the Reserve Bank announcement. So I was a bit grumpy thanks to the Reserve Bank. That's my story and I'm sticking to it. Anyway, with that, let's get the show on the road. So as always, just quickly the running order, this introduction, the house rules, about the models, and then some key slides. As with all of these things, we'll get some questions and answers. Question and answers being the main part of the show, about an hour and a half perhaps. Sign off, of course, after that. And as always, in the house rules, just to emphasize, this is not financial advice. Don't know your individual circumstances. I talk generally about what's going on, but if you need specific financial advice, go and find a financial advisor. I am not he. Also, do play nice in the chat room. No racial slurs. The comments are being moderated, and if necessary, we will take people down. But we don't like to do that, and we do encourage people to, tic-tac in the chat. Also, 6th of July 21 is the date today. So if you're watching this replay, take account of that. Use that Walk the World if you want to get my attention, specifically if you want to ask a question, because there's always so much going on in the chat. If you do ask using Walk the World, there's a really good chance I'll be able to see your question and try and address it. And also I have enabled Super Chat, which does two things. Firstly, you can make sure that your question goes to the top of the list, more chance of getting it spotted and answered. And also, if you'd like to make a contribution to what we do here, would be greatly appreciated. We don't do this for profit. We do this because we really care about Australia and Australians, and we think there's some very important conversations to be had about what's going on. And so we want to continue to do that. So if you feel supporting us, then please do. I will just quickly, for those who don't know about what we do, we survey households all the time, 52,000 households a year, and that goes into our core market model. The core market model segments information in multiple dimensions. Think of it like my Rubik's Cube, as I often say. And that allows us then to talk about different scenarios. Those scenarios allow us to then understand what might be happening down the track. And for example, that allows me to take the mortgage stress data, the price history trajectory, the buying and selling intentions, the migration data, the economic data, bang it all in the core market model through the scenarios. And that then allows me to analyze at a postcode level, at a state, regional, Australia level, everything that's going on. And that gives us a view then of what might be happening with regard to individual prices ahead. Not predictions, but just scenarios. I'd also just highlight that we also do run our one-to-one service. This is where we can have a conversation about a particular suburb, Can't give specific financial advice, but I can give you a lot of information about the trends in a particular suburb, looking at stress, home price trend data, and all of that stuff. It's based on my modelling, and it's a book normally done by Zoom or by phone discussion up to an hour. And if you're interested, there is a cost involved because it takes about a day to do all the research. But we're booking at the moment 3 to 5 weeks ahead. A lot of people are very interested in terms of getting the latest information and scenarios on a particular suburb. So if that's something that interests you, then you can reach for me by the DFA blog and send me a message and I'll send you details. Now, let's start with the Bank for International Settlements. In their most recent annual report, they issued a warning, basically saying that given the rapid rise in house prices across the world, including Australia, there are challenges being posed by this to the recovery. Judging by what some central banks are being confronted with, they'll have little choice but to tighten, the BIS warned, that postponing normalisation beyond a certain point can actually harm the economy. And that's the important message, right? There is a point where you've got to pull the economy back. You can't just go on letting interest rates run lower and the debt run higher. And therefore, there is definitely a concern that if you keep the monetary policy too accommodative to support fiscal consolidation, in other words, all of the government spending, you could build up further financial imbalances in the private sector. Absolutely. Now, the BIS is very clear on this. Given the exceptionally low service burdens that could be also induce further increases in government debt, in both cases, the economy's sensitivity to higher interest rates would rise. That is a very important warning. I don't think the Reserve Bank read it, but they should have. Now, the other thing to make the point is that oil is up. The OPEC situation deteriorated. They basically didn't manage to get the agreement that they hoped to get. And so typically, when there's a failed OPEC meeting, normally crude oil prices go down, but on this occasion, it looks like it might be going up. And in fact, the Bloomberg report said at stake is the stability of the global economic recovery amid growing inflationary pressures and the ability of Producers Alliance to retain its hard-won control over oil markets. If oil prices go to $100, that's a real problem. And that's, of course, another very significant inflationary pressure. Now, of course, the RBA today held again, and it said a few things. They decided to retain the April 24 bond as a target for the yield control and target 10 basis points. In other words, they don't want to kick it out further. That's a sort of a slight tightening edge. They also announced they were going to continue government bond purchases, but reduce the rate from $5 billion to $4 billion a week. Now, if that runs through to mid-November, they will have, wait for it, 30% of all government bonds issued in Australia by November, and about 15% of state bonds, according to what Philip Lowe said during the press conference. That's amazing. That's just horrendous. They're going to maintain the cash rate at 10 basis points and the exchange settlement balance at 0. And they're talking about this providing continued monetary support to the economy, needing to transition from the recovery phase, etc., etc. And of course, they always mention, as they do, full employment and inflation consistent with a target. Now, the next point is they actually said that, look, the economy is a bit stronger, but the lockdowns, clearly, and the virus clearly creates risks. And then they say that the labour market recovered faster than expected. We're at 5.1% in the main numbers. Well, those numbers, of course, as we've discussed previously, are pretty distorted. And there are also some firms reporting shortages of labour, and that's linked, of course, to the international borders. Then they said that despite the strong recovery in jobs and reports of labour shortages and wage outcomes remain subdued. And whilst there is a pickup in inflation and wages growth to be expected, it's likely to be gradual and modest. And their central scenario says that inflation underlying will be 1.5% over 21 and 2% by 2023. There will be a little blip, but that's just the base effect, up to 3.1%. So don't assume that that is core inflation on their numbers. Now, you and I know that inflation is a lot higher, but that's on the official ones. And over the year to the June quarter, because of the reversal of COVID-19. And they also made the point that they need wages growth to be around 3% or above to really be able to get this to work. Now, wages growth, of course, is nowhere near that at the moment, and they don't expect it to be there anytime soon. So they'll maintain that 10 basis point target for the bonds. That's trying to control the yield curve. And that means that they'll be able to continue to, quote, support the Australian economy. In other words, cheap funds makes the government debt, which was much cheaper than it would otherwise be. The final drawdowns under the term funding facility, that was the very cheap money to the banks. They drew down $188 billion. It's there for 3 years. But of course, from this point on, the banks will need to actually draw down funds from other sources, and that'll be more expensive. So that's going to be more upward pressure on rates. And they mentioned the housing market, raising the question again of the impact of rising house prices and low interest rates. The bank will be monitoring trends. I'm glad they're monitoring, but they should be doing more than monitoring. And the question is, are lending standards up to scratch? The short answer is no, they're not. And they're saying that they're highly committed to monetary conditions, and they're going to try and target that 2 to 3 range percent. And on it goes. Now, the point about all this is, look, this is definitely some tightening. It's quite hawkish relative to what many people expected. But of course, a lot of people are also saying that relative to what they should do, it's still quite limited. And I think in the press conference today, Lowe was sort of straddling 2 lines. The first line was, things are a lot better than we expected back in February. And he made the point that they were expecting inflation to be in a worse position, and they expected unemployment to be much higher back then. The economy has bounced back. But of course, despite that, they're not really doing much to recognise that changed position. And then, of course, they mentioned the question about the virus again and the lockdown. So, look, there's a lot of uncertainty, slight tightening. The markets did react, interestingly, and what I might just do is go across to, let's go there first, and then go there, and then go there. Okay, so if you look here, this is the ASX 200, which was, nothing particularly exciting to write home about. But what's interesting is that the 10-year bond actually dropped a little after having peaked around the time of the announcement. The 3-year also moved, as you can see there, up and then back a little bit. And the 2-year also is now down a little. And the exchange rate, well, it sort of moved up to 75.81. So what's interesting about that is that, the exchange rate's going in the wrong direction still. They want the exchange rate, they need the exchange rate lower if they're going to get the economy to be competitive internationally. So that's a bit of a problem. I'd also make the point that there was a bit of a hike in volatility rates, although not dramatically, but just up a little. And so essentially, I think my conclusion on all of this is that really things all but washed through. There wasn't really a lot going on here in terms of the fundamental market moves that some people thought there would be. And a lot of people, of course, were predicting significantly different findings than what the Reserve has come up with in terms of what's going on. And just to give you a few examples of that, CBA suggested that maybe rates would be rising in 2022. This was before, of course, the Reserve Bank. We've penciled in a 15 basis point increase, says Gavin Aird at CBA, Gareth Aird at CBA in 2022, and then followed up later on. And an article on the ABC, mortgage costs to jump as interest rates rises, warns ahead of the Reserve Bank meeting. So that's pretty much the story of the day so far. And here is Domain saying mortgage repayments could rise sooner than expected as banks forecast higher and earlier cash rate hikes. Quote, borrowers could face an average variable mortgage rate of over 4.3% from as early as 2023, new modelling shows, if recent forecasts for the cash rate, TIT 1.25, are reached. Now, of course, also consumer confidence got knocked, and this is the ANZ Roy Morgan. So it dropped 3.9% to its lowest level since the first week in April. And interestingly, the drop was quite widespread, fell in Sydney, rest of New South Wales, down in Brisbane, Melbourne and Adelaide. And in fact, all of the sub-indices, so pretty much across the board, all went south. And that includes time to buy a household item, weekly inflation expectations and current economic conditions. So this is not looking particularly strong at the moment. Plus, the retail turnover was weaker than perhaps some expected. It was 0.4% in May. That's update the previous 0.1 preliminary. Not much change in terms of the bits, but interestingly, Victoria saw a change from minus 1.5 to 0.9. New South Wales recorded a flat result, but you'd expect things to be a little bit weaker in the next one because of the lockdowns. And the main themes from the retail trade preliminary release remain relevant. For the final release, retail in May was impacted by the Victorian lockdown. And of course, that's the point. Every time there's a lockdown, retail then takes a further bath. Dwelling approvals were also down. Interestingly, approvals were overall down 7.1% in May, following the 5.7% decrease in April. And approvals for private sector houses fell across all mainland states. That's, of course, the end of Home Builder. And Western Australia was down 18%, South Australia 16%. Some of the units were a bit different. Units in WA was up slightly, but nevertheless overall down. So again, we're seeing now that stimulus being withdrawn and of the impact on the approvals happening. Building risks, of course, are also there, and this came out quite recently. Inferno risk list grows. This is about Victoria, and the more than 75 buildings have been added to Victoria's flammable cladding risk list. Cladding Safety Victoria figures show that the Victorian Building Authority has referred 719 buildings to the organisation, up from 643 at the end of 2020. And 249 buildings have been approved for funding to fix cladding issues. Now, of course, some of that's going to be picked up by the states. I'd make the point that in other states, it's not anything like the same. So we've got to assume we have precisely the same issues in other states. This flammable cladding issue is going to be one that really haunts the high-rise sector ahead, I think. If I then go on to some of the broader issues, the Vancouver Sun had a very interesting article talking about the sky-high housing prices causing psychological harm in Vancouver. And what happens psychologically is hard-working people denied the opportunity to own decent housing in the place they yearn to call home. Anxiety is common, so is anger, and for many a feeling of inadequacy. Those acidic feelings are especially strong among young adults. They feel they're failing because they can't secure their financial foundation. That gives rise to stress, said Paul Kershew, one of the professors there. Many delay a fundamental part of what has historically made people happy, starting their families. So there's a consequence. And the point I want to make here is this is not just an academic discussion about economics and interest rates. This is real people being really badly impacted by the decisions that central bankers are taking. And I really don't believe that they understand the full impact and the psychological harm that they're actually creating by what they're doing. And I wish that they would take more notice of this broader perspective, because I think it's really important. Also, another one here, thanks Cookie Boy for this, hardship. 1 in 5 Australians still facing hardship. This is actually from information from the ABS. In 2020, nearly 1 in 5 households, or 19%, were unable to raise $2,000 within a week for something important. And it's interesting that they, really went to town on this. Speaking to Nest Egg, ClearScore Managing Director Steve Smythe said that the factors that drive a high number are about getting types of individuals getting access to credit. And he goes on to talk about some of the ecosystem. And towards the end, he talks about the fact that buy now, pay later operators are actually capitalizing on this. And I see it in my surveys too. So what we're seeing is quite a lot of households who are in financial difficulty, not going to use credit cards because I can't use credit cards, get credit cards, keep credit cards, but actually use buy now, pay later. And of course, buy now, pay later is not reported as credit in Australia. So it's a way, effectively a backdoor way of being able to support some of these people. But frankly, we know that about 20 to 25 of them end up paying the fees, and unfortunately, therefore, end up paying a lot more than they would expect to. So this is another, interesting sort of swathe of data that highlights the issues. Moody, of course, as I showed in my earlier show today, came out with saying mortgage stress is 20% of households, and that's based on the 30% of income going to service the mortgage, which is a bit of a funny way to calculate it, but that's been something they've continued to do. But nevertheless, wherever you look, you've got a bunch of issues. So, we're not out of the woods yet, I guess is what I'm saying. And on one hand, the Reserve Bank is saying, well, we'll, be a bit hawkish in some areas and try and, not do too much too quick. But on the other hand, there's a lot of questions as to what's going to happen, I think. Now, if you want to get into detail on what are the real issues in housing, I do recommend that you go and seek out the housing elephant in the room and what to do about it. That was an interview I put up last week with one of the key researchers from City Futures, who have done significant research on what's really going on with housing. It's nothing to do with supply. It's nothing to do with architecture and those sorts of things. It's fundamentally about debt, the way that debt is, frankly, driving everything. And there was a wonderful quote that I saw from an article in New Zealand that said, look, I don't understand that the New Zealand economy, for example, is a housing market with a little bit of an economy bolted on the edge. And I think actually Australia is not far behind. So I recommend that post if you want to get into some of the more strategic and philosophical issues that are driving what's going on at the moment. Now, if I go back to mortgage stress, which of course is one of the things I always cover in the first Tuesday of each month, mortgage stress was up in May and in June. This is actually the June number here. It's at 41.3%, which is slightly higher than last month. And the household debt's still very high, of course, even at 180. We've still got massive amounts of stuff going in there. This is the May number. So there we had the overall mortgage stress of 41.13 and the rental stress at 38.24. And if I look at then June, then it's gone up slightly. So 41.33 in terms of mortgage stress and 37.95 for rental stress. And I won't spend too much time on this other than to highlight that we still have some interesting divergences. So mortgage stress in Victoria is at 44.97%. That's come down a little. The highest level of stress, though, is there, plus Tasmania at 50. And in fact, Tasmania's come down a little in recent times as the economy's pulled up a little. But some of the other states not doing so well. On rental stress, New South Wales at 50% is really, really registering the significant rises now. That's partly, of course, to do with the most recent things that have gone on. Remember, there's no support now for the rental sector. Investor stress is also quite high. The ACT and New South Wales have the highest proportion of households in investor stress. And overall financial stress, which is the aggregate measure of all of them, is highest in New South Wales, pretty high in Victoria at 41, also high in the ACT. And that's interesting because a lot of the time people don't talk about the ACT, but I think we should, because there are obviously a lot of well-paid civil servants, but there are also a lot of less well-paid people in the ACT doing it tough. If I then look at it by segment, somewhat similar story to last time, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but the stress levels are highest amongst young growing families, first-time buyers in particular, at 75%. So 3/4 of those who are buying in at the moment are really pushing the envelope to be able to make sure that they can get that property and get that mortgage. The mortgage is still 50% higher than it was a year ago for many first-time buyers. The rental stress is highest among first generation people to Australia, what I call multicultural establishment, particularly migrants and those who've actually come in perhaps with not necessarily lots of resources behind them. But also the young affluent is also significantly stressed too. And then investor stress, the young affluent groups are by far the most significantly exposed. These are people who think they know what they're doing with regard to investment property, but clearly don't. And so they've got these investment properties that are actually not making great returns. The exclusive professionals are also up there, of course. And the overall levels of financial stress are highest amongst young growing families and also among young affluents. So the younger segment of the population, are the ones that are actually most directly being impacted. If you look elsewhere, sure, there are a lot of, middle Australians in suburban mainstream, a lot of battlers on the urban fringe as well being impacted. But these younger people, the ones with the biggest amount of debt, the ones where the banks are actually giving them money whether they can afford it or not, quite often with the bank of mum and dad in tow as well, that's all part of the story. If I then just quickly say that in terms of the number of households in stress, the number one position this time is the Western Australian postcode 6065, which includes a whole bunch of areas, including Wanneroo, more than 9,000. Then we go to Narra Warren in Victoria, 3805 at 9,800, a very large postcode. Again, one of these high growth corridors, as is Berwick and Huckaway with 8,000 there. And then we go to another Victorian postcode. So you can see Victoria's right up the top there. In fact, Ballarat is on the list, Pakenham is on the list. Then we come to New South Wales with Mount Annan, Roxburgh Park, places like that. The point I want to make is that a lot of these are these high growth corridors, and we're seeing this now in spades, absolute spades. So the large debts that they took previously are now coming home to roost. In terms of rental stress, New South Wales, around St George's Basin and places like that are actually number one on the list. And then we come to Greystanes and Wentworthville, Westmead, with a large number of households there in rental stress. Then another New South Wales postcode, Lethbridge Park and places like that. Then we come to the North Gosford, East Gosford, West Gosford area, so up in the Central Coast with more than 9,000. And then we go to Blacktown. So you can see here that New South Wales is where a lot of the issues are with regard to rental stress. Then we go to Queensland, and then we come back to Bondi. I highlight Bondi because it's close into Sydney, and of course Bondi is in the middle of the current lockdown. And then we go to Queensland again, and on it goes. I'll also make the point that even places like the Rocks and Sydney itself, postcode 2000 there, is on the list. Not good. If we then go to stressed investors, we see that Queensland is at the top of the list. Places like Surfers Paradise, also the question of places like Avondale and Avoca, both in Queensland. Then we go to Surrey Hills and Darlinghurst, that's sort of in this inner city, inner suburban areas, again, often with big rentals, and yet what you're finding is quite a lot of vacant properties. A lot of the properties close in have very high vacancies, like in Victoria 3000. A lot of investors are not actually seeing many people at all actually dealing with that. And then we've got of course our old favourites of Mandurah and places like that. By the way, I will be doing an update on Mandurah in the next few days. I've just been researching that some more, so I'll come back and talk about that in more detail later. And on it goes. And then finally, for financial stress overall, unfortunately, Mount Druitt, that postcode 2770, has the highest degree of financial stress. Then Victoria, Melbourne 3000, a lot of businesses struggling, a lot of renters struggling, so it's right up there. Then we go to Cranbrook, again in Victoria. That is, of course, one of those high growth corridors. Then we go to Narre Warren, and then we go to Queensland, Ipswich, and places like that. And then we go to Greystanes, Westmead in New South Wales, and up to Queensland again, Hoopers Crossing, then Central Coast, Gosford, on it goes. So the point to make here is that there's quite a wide range of stress, but overall financial stress is pretty high. And these are lots and lots of households. These are the numbers of households that are being impacted. So 17,000, 16,000, 15,000. These are big numbers. And I'm afraid that I don't think the Reserve Bank really is quite on top of this and understand what's really going on. Now, what I can do also is just to show you some mapping. This is actually the mortgage stress accounts. I've set it up for Sydney 2000 at the moment, and just to explain that this is the key. So the darker colours and the sort of reddy orange is the most extreme, and then the blue is the best. So as you pull out from Sydney, you can see there that there are some significant footprints up around Lane Cove and around Bondi, and then as you pull out, you begin to see the same story as we quite often see, which is that quite a lot of the pain here is actually further out west. So as you pull out further, you can see places like Liverpool come into shot. And then if you pull out a bit further, you can see Blacktown beginning to show, and then Campbelltown and some of the other places too. So you can begin to see how these areas are actually being impacted. Western Sydney is where a lot of the pain is, but I'd also highlight again, there are some pockets closer in. Now, if we then pick another postcode, I'll just do Melbourne for now, and do the same sort of journey again. We'll start in Melbourne 3000. So this is mortgage stress, of course. We pull out, we begin to see again some of the same phenomenon, which is that you find some pockets of stress. As you pull away, you see that it's quite variable. Over in the west there, beyond Wyndham. And if you pull out further, you can also see it's up further north as well. And so you can see that there's a real patchwork here. It's not uniform. in pretty much all the suburbs. It's very variable, but quite a lot of it's these high growth corridors. We've got a lot of building, a lot of new stuff, a lot of homeland packages, a lot of people still being cajoled to buy homeland packages at the time when effectively stress is so high. That's a real big deal in my view. I will just do one more stress. I'm going to go over to Perth to do that one. I don't necessarily have time to do all of the postcodes and all the locations, but we'll just sort of do a little bit. And again, what you see is you pull out from Perth and go north, you start seeing the numbers come up, and you see them quite significant. A lot of the border areas close to the coast there have a lot of new development, a lot of homeland packages. And as you go south and as you go north, like places like Wanneroo, Joondalup, places like that, you can see that there's quite a significant, and even Mandra's there. Not dramatic, not bright red, but still a lot of people, because there are a lot of people in and around the area. So there is, again, significant pockets. Now, I will just briefly then switch over and look at rental stress and just do a similar whiz around. Wait for that to load. Okay, so this is actually in Melbourne, and the point to make there is that in the centre of Melbourne, there's a pocket of significant rental stress. That's because, of course, a lot of people are struggling with hours, struggling with vacancies and all those things as well. So there's a lot of issues there. But as you pull out, again, what you find is quite significant similarities between the rental stress and mortgage stress. High growth areas around down towards down along, same sort of thing. And if you pull out further, you get a somewhat similar view. I will just do one more. I'll go up to Brisbane. And tell me if you would like me to spend a complete show and just going through this in more detail. I'm happy to do it. But, it's trying to work out what the right pacing on all of this is. Brisbane is not showing the same degree of stress. So the numbers are, not quite so bad as you can see there as we pull out. But nevertheless, there are the odd pockets that come in. Ipswich, of course, is a significant hotspot. And we have a few other areas as well, south and north of Brisbane. But Brisbane is not under the same pressure as many other areas. But if you went out towards Toowoomba or places like that, then you would see a very considerably different story. So I hope that was of some use. Let me just pop back to the presentation. I've nearly finished, and then we'll start getting some questions going and go from there and see where the conversations go. Okay, stress mapping. All right, just before we do that, let me just share our scenarios. I always update these scenarios. As you know, the scenarios are a way of trying to sort of get a feel of what's going on. Honestly, a lot hasn't changed, really, compared with last month, because we always ran these different scenarios. These are just ways of thinking about alternative futures. It's not necessarily saying it's going to be like this. But this is the baseline view. The only thing that's really changed is that we've taken, because of what's happened with the lockdowns, the best case, the COVID vaccination rollout happening, had to go backwards, went down by 5%. This one went up by 5%. Other than that, we're still saying there is a scenario where house prices can still rise if rates stay low, if the Reserve Bank plays its cards as they said they're going to play their cards. But on the other hand, there's a much higher risk now, I think, of things not going well. And look, it could well get to the point where some of these scenarios get reweighted to the point where the longer term crunch story, with all the vaccine issues and with the various virus variants that are coming through, the Lambda one being the latest, we could actually see this moving quite sharply. So there is still some risk to house prices, but there is also a path to higher house price growth, even at this stage, although nowhere near as strongly as we had earlier in the year. And remember, I'm looking effectively 3 years out. So there you go. That's the story there. Now, with all that, let me just have a quick look and see what's going on. Quite a few different comments. Yes, lots of questions, lots of comments. Let's just go back up to the top. Okay. I don't know whether you saw, I just will highlight the point that Chris Bates is coming on next week. Tony LaCantra is coming on the week after. Tony, of course, had to cancel a couple of weeks ago, but good news, he's back on deck now. So that'll be good news. Okay, questions. Aussie Jen talked about, I hear CBA has now sold off all their ATMs, just now cost $2.50 per transaction for their own customer base. Well, there's a real drive away from using ATMs and cash. The banks are really championing this. I think we need a right to have access to cash. It should be a universal service obligation. And the fact you now have to pay to withdraw money out of your own bank's ATMs is disgraceful. Unfortunately, some banks already went down that route. I expect that to become quite common. I also think, again, there has to be some movement at a political level here. We have to actually make it clear to our politicians that this is not an acceptable strategy. There should be access to cash where and when we need it. But, unfortunately, that's just the way we are. I did do a show the other day about what's happening in the UK, where Australia, where the equivalent of Australia Post, the Royal Mail in the UK, is basically providing a service centre for a particular location. All the various banks are using that service centre as an outlet directly. I think that's probably something that's worth considering here. Okay, let's have a look. Interesting comment from Christian here. When will people realize that currency is volatile and not to be relied on as a store of value? It's an interesting question because, of course, what's happening at the moment is we've got this relative movement between central banks around the world. If one central bank starts going in a different direction, I'm thinking, for example, in Canada, they're talking about raising rates quite quickly and they're quite close to their target inflation rate. That will have a significant impact on the exchange rate. So there's some significant movements. I guess the point there, and David, asked me about on the Aussie dollar, is it or is it not something we should be, banking on, as it were? The Reserve Bank would like the Aussie dollar a lot lower. The trouble is that we're all sort of marching the same tune at the moment, so the chances are the Reserve Bank will not get its wish. I still think the Reserve Bank will struggle with around 75. And whilst the US may strengthen a little, I'm not sure it's going to strengthen dramatically, but I think volatility is what we're going to see. And, if we start seeing the markets coming off, that could change things quite a lot. And if we start seeing the Fed tapering and tightening, I was reading something today suggesting that maybe the Fed will do it in September. That could significantly move the exchange rate. So a lot of questions. Just see what else I've got here. Any news on commercial property? Cookie Boy asks. Yeah, well, it's interesting. There's a lot of commercial pressure at the moment. Commercial rents are still pretty flat. A lot of small businesses, particularly, of course, are struggling at the moment. I see that in my survey. They've got no rental holidays now. And so some of them who would have traded through previously can't. But the big commercial sector, the high-rise office space, a lot of that is vacant now. And the returns are a lot lower. So I wonder whether they'll get converted into, more high-rise close-in for residential accommodation, except, of course, there's already lots of high-rise accommodation locally, right? So I'm not sure whether that will play out, but it's a big question. Interestingly, the demand for out-of-town warehousing has gone through the roof as people use warehouses as basically a distribution centre to deliver to people's homes. And interestingly also, the rentals on central CBD office are way down, which means, of course, a lot of the big investment firms who've invested in those are seeing their returns being chopped. So very, very choppy waters at the moment. Okay, Master Singleton, you have asked about 7250. Well, funnily enough, I can do 7250. So let's have a look at getting that up. Let me just go there. I need to go there. I need to go there. I need to do that. Okay. 7250. I don't know where 7250 will be. 7250. Whoops. Okay, here we go. I'm just going to put it up now. Here you go, 7250. I'll get rid of the chat so you can see it. All right, so this is East Launceston, places like that. 21,900 households in the particular postcode. Can you see that all right? Hopefully you can. 8,000 borrowing, 9,000 renting, 6,800 properties for rent. There's around 5,600 property investors. Overall financial stress is 37%. So that's middle of the road. But look at this. Mild mortgage stress, 66%. So 2/3 of households in and around that area have financial flow pressures. Remember how I'm measuring mortgage stress? It's not immediate crisis. It's just money coming in, money going out, more money going out than coming in. Well, that's quite high at 66. Rental stress is pretty low at 17%, 1,812. And the investor community, 21% of investors are stressed at 1,150. And here is my modelling. Under the base case scenario, we're looking at price rises over 3 years of maybe 8% max. If you have a more neutral case, which is in other words that the virus doesn't go away and the borders open a lot longer out, then we're looking at almost no change and there's a fall for houses. Units, somewhat similar, not quite as dramatically up or down or sideways. So that's my sort of takeout on that particular postcode. So I hope that's of help for you. Now, what I will do is just do another couple of postcodes because I saw there were some in the chat beforehand. And somebody asked me to do 4014. So let's put that in. Okay. Nudgee and places like that. Put that one back up. There you go. Okay, so this is 4014. Quite a contained postcode, 4,500 households, 2,300 borrowing, 1,600 renting, 1,200 properties for rent, and the rental property owners 1,200. 41% in financial stress, so that's slightly higher than Launceston, but 46% only in mortgage stress, just over 1,000, 3% risking default. Higher rental stress than we saw at Launceston at 32% or 520, and the investment stress is 25%, 318. And the modelling suggests that over the next 3 years, we could be looking at prices rising for houses by up to 13% over the next 3 years. This is cumulative. That's in my best case scenario. That assumes that the vaccines get rolled out and the borders open as planned. The neutral case is not as good, about 4 or 5% higher over 3 years. And if we get a really significant second or third outbreak, depending on where you count it from, prices could fall slightly. Units, not quite so strongly performing either up or down, but somewhat similar. So that's that one. Excuse me. All right. I'll do some more from beforehand. I did have a few others noted down, but let's just go down the questions. What else have we got? Whoops. Let's go there. Yep. Okay. Interesting comment there. CBA now already factoring new 5.25 stress testing. Yeah, CBA is up the ante. Others are also up in the ante. We know that quietly the APRA conversation with the banks has heated up slightly, and they're basically saying you need to actually, come back closer to what you should have been doing in the first place. There is quite a lot of evidence, unfortunately, of a lot of banks still being very loose with their lending. I'm seeing a lot of first-time buyers getting loans that they probably shouldn't, with loan-to-income ratios at 10, 11, 12. That's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Shouldn't be allowed. What's going to happen, of course, is that over time, with interest rates rising, they're going to get caught. So, yeah, other banks are following. Also, I'll just make the point, responsible lending is parked at the moment. Unfortunately, the Greens' motion to take the responsible lending bill, remember the bill was to remove responsible lending obligations from the banks and just say, don't worry about it, just put all the weight on individual households. Well, that bill was not passed, but neither was it taken out of the Parliament. And that was because Pauline Hanson wants to get a version of the bill that tries to protect payday lending and leases, but not the broader removal of responsible lending. Now, of course, Frydenberg the other day said he's still going to try and put it through, but I think it's pretty much dead in the water at the moment, which is good news. I think the responsible lending obligations should be maintained because it's about the only protection we've got. Also, interestingly, the latest report on complaints has shown an increase in people complaining under the responsible lending obligations discussions. So for me, that's very important. Other banks, I think, will also tighten their standards. But I also noticed that Philip Lowe in the press conference today said they're looking at loan-to-income ratios, debt-to-income ratios, and even lifting that target rate of affordability. But they're not proposing to do anything at the moment. It's just sort of thinking about it, right? Well, they should have thought about it a long time ago. New Zealand, of course, has taken much more significant steps, or even there, the steps are still probably quite weak. Okay. This is interesting conversation. Two 26-year-old couple trying to buy a house, 30% of their income will go straight on the mortgage. We don't get in now, prices go up, then we'll be stuffed. Sure, okay. If you've done the work and you know precisely what your financials are and you've got a cash flow and you've modelled it at 2 or 3% above where you are and you can assume that the income is secure, in other words, jobs are secure, I'm not saying don't buy. All I'm saying is buy sensibly. Don't necessarily, over leverage yourself. The 30% thing, just to be clear, was used quite a lot 20 to 30 years ago by banks to sort of rule of thumb. If it was more than 30%, we won't lend, right? That's out the window now. There are people getting 36, 40, 45% of their income to pay the mortgage. And some of them can manage that fine. What I'm worried about are those who actually commit without having done the work, commit without thinking about what happens if my job goes, or what happens if my income is compressed because of illness or whatever it is, right? Have you got an escape plan? The other point is that the rate of growth of house prices is probably going to go much slower from this point forward, I think. Well, I think we've seen that big surge and already it's coming ease off. There's some articles over the last 2 or 3 weeks suggesting that movements are actually easing off. It could well be, if the borders stay shut and rates start moving up, this might actually start turning the ship the other way. So Phil Lowe said today he is very concerned that we don't see house prices moving faster ahead than income growth, which suggests to me that there could be a more benign movement of house prices ahead. So, you may not be trapped and shut out. And also, don't believe all the hype that you read about all the indices, right? You need to look at on-the-ground individual locations and individual types of properties. There are still a number of postcodes where the growth levels over the last 2 or 3 years are nothing like reported nationally. And some of those areas are even quite close into the centre of town. So, again, go granular, do your research, and if you are financially able to meet those commitments, plus a bit, assume rates will go up. And also think about fixed rates. You can still fix quite well for 2 or 3 years at the moment, and that gives a bit of flexibility because, of course, rates can't go up on a fixed rate loan, but they can go on a variable rate loan. So that's how I think about it. Interesting question from the New Voice. Where does the money for QE come from? Where in the budget is it noted by the Gov as debt we have to pay back? Will they ever stop QE? Can they stop QE? Money out of thin air? It is, because basically they're lifting both sides of the balance sheet, right? So basically what they're doing is you've got government issuing bonds, right? That increases the debt on the balance sheet of the government, okay? Those bonds are then effectively bought by the RBA, so that gives them an offset. The RBA then increases its balance sheet, and they're saying it's going to be significantly 30% of total bonds will be owned by the RBA. So, but basically, it's both sides. So it's funny money, right? It's not real money. It's just moving both sides, right? And that's the problem. Of course, the issue is if you increase the volume of dollars in the system, in theory, that should be inflationary, except it may not be, because it depends what happens to the money there. Remember that, of course, in the US, where they've been at this longer, we've got the situation where banks are now parking their overnight money back with the Fed because they don't know what to do with it. So unfortunately, you're just lifting both sides of the equation. So it is funny money. Can they reverse it? I don't know how. I haven't yet seen any example anywhere among central banks around the world where they've been able to reverse this quantitative easing effect. So I've been saying for some time, this is a cul-de-sac we've driven into. I'm not sure there's an exit. That's the problem that I see. All they can do is go on doing it, going on doing it, going on doing it, and hoping that in the medium term, the inflationary pressure comes through enough to deflate the true value of the liabilities they've got. And so when they come to repay it, as they will sometime later, when they have to reverse all of this, the actual real value is lower than it might otherwise be. But frankly, inflating your way out is the only route that I can see. But of course, if you inflate it out, then you've got inflation. And you know what happens when you have inflation? Interest rates go up. If interest rates go up, government debt costs rise. If government debt costs rise, then the whole thing falls flat on its face again. So the Reserve Bank is locked in. It can neither go one way nor the other way. And therefore, this is a classic example where a decade plus of poor policy from central bankers and the Bank for International Settlements is now coming home to roost. I don't see an exit, and that's the concern I've got. So they're going to fiddle around, and they're going to sort of do a bit more QE and, you know, taper it down a little, etc., and hope that it somehow magically works its way out. I don't think there is a clear exit plan. And interestingly, every time the Reserve Bank is asked by politicians about what is your exit plan, the RBA avoids the question. That, for me, is quite significant. And by the way, nobody on the press conference tonight, all of the media from, you know, all sorts of analysts, not one of them asked about the exit strategy for this quantitative easing program. That was the blooming obvious question that should have been asked, and not one person out of the, 15, 20 questions that were asked dared to ask that question. That is the one question that the Reserve Bank has not, to my satisfaction, got any answer to. And Not Environment said, I locked my loan in for 4 years yesterday to it. No, if it's a good rate, I think that's probably pretty good. We're already seeing fixed rates going up. I did a show yesterday with Mozo where we spoke about the current movements in rates. This was before the Reserve Bank announced them. We noted that the Reserve Bank's signalling was such that it had translated into higher fixed rate mortgages, particularly 3 and 4 and 5 year rates. So they're already going up. I think it's unlikely they will go lower than where they are. I actually said about 3 months ago that my sense was that was probably the low point in the cycle in terms of locking in fixed rates, but you can still get quite good fixed rates. Shop around. Don't necessarily just go to the big four. Some of the smaller organisations have better rates. Use CanStar or Mozo or Rate City or one of the other comparison sites to be able to make some sensible decisions. Don't just go to one and assume it's the best rate. Shop around. And also negotiate, because the banks are still willing to negotiate. It surprises me, so I'll make the more general point, surprises me how often people don't negotiate with the bank, right? They just assume the rate is the rate. No, it's not. You can still negotiate, and it's worth negotiating, and threaten to take your business elsewhere. Play one bank off against another bank, right? You can do that quite successfully, and I've seen good examples where people have gotten another 50 basis points off, which may not seem a lot, but when rates are so low, 50 basis points is actually worth quite a bit. There's an interesting one from Kelvin. Do you see the property market shifting its money into more regional centres after this whole COVID fiasco? It's already happening. So we know that regional centres have actually seen significant growth in the value of properties. For example, I live out in regional New South Wales here. We had a lot of people move down from Sydney and buy large properties, paying top dollar plus. So the value of properties in this area has gone significantly higher. It's also put a lot of locals out. They can't now afford to get into the market, unfortunately. Also, rents have gone up as well because people have decided to move down on rent first and then look for somewhere and then buy. So that's the phenomenon. In fact, vacancy rates, if you look at rental vacancy rates, they're a lot lower in the regions relative to closer into, say, Sydney and Melbourne at the moment. So yeah, there's a big shift afoot. And the fact that you can now use NBN and work remotely, and the fact that you can, find properties for less money further out than you might close in, is really hitting home. So we're seeing some of the really big numbers now in terms of growth rates out in the regions relative to close in. I don't think it's going to change. And I think every time we get these lockdowns and, COVID crisis, it just reinforces the why should I bother? The other point I'd make is, of course, is that there's quite a lot of movement from Melbourne and Sydney up towards Queensland. So Queensland has been one of the big beneficiaries of all that stuff being going on. And so a lot of people have actually decided to buy up in Queensland, in some cases even sight unseen, although that's a bit of the exception. So again, prices are much lower up in Queensland. The rental returns are a lot higher. And in fact, Queensland and Tasmania and Adelaide are three areas that are quite attractive now for people who potentially would have bought elsewhere. So it depends what you want. But yeah, that's the story. I think the regions will benefit, but not necessarily really, because a lot of locals are now getting priced out and they have to move further away to be able to get anything to buy. So it doesn't really necessarily solve anything, it just moves the problem. And that's been often the case, unfortunately. Okay, what else have we got? A few questions. What's that one there? Oops. This is from Jason. Thanks for the super chat. Really appreciate it. Those are awful mortgage and rentals, all stress figures, especially at this point in time. Not something that seems to be reported or talked about in my experience. That's precisely the point. That's one of the reasons why I make these shows, Jason, because the fact is that none of the banks want to talk about this. They only look at individual loans. They don't look at household finances. My research is from the point of view of total household finances. And remember, what I'm looking at here is not default, right? So I'm not saying that 41% of mortgages are in default. I'm saying they've got issues managing their cash flow. And, I quoted the Moody at 20%. I showed you that 1 in 5 households have issues with, getting any free cash. These are all the sort of characteristics of things that aren't being spoken about. If you talk to some of the agencies that help people, the debt counsellors, they just are completely wall to wall with people struggling with the financial footprint they've got. What we have at the moment is this two-speed economy, this K-shaped economy. You've got some doing really well, and they're still working full time, and they haven't had to spend as much money on traveling and those things, so they've actually got a lot of savings. But you've got the other part of the economy that's doing really badly. And unfortunately, my worry is that these are not being represented, neither are they actually being advocated for. And just saying, well, just borrow some more, have another loan, or have a buy now pay later on top. This debt stuff can really get really nasty really quickly. And the other point to make is a lot of people have no idea where they are, so they don't necessarily run cash flows, and they don't necessarily run an analysis of money coming in, money going out, so they don't know where they are. So quite a few people get boxed into this, and once they get boxed in, it's really hard to get out the way again. And remember, rates are pretty much as low as they've been, and we've had a lot of support over the last 18 months. JobKeeper, JobSeeker, that's all gone now. So I think we're going to see significant ongoing pressures. And, I hope I'm proved wrong, but nothing that I'm seeing at the moment is suggesting other than it's going to continue to grind forward. And as it grinds forward, more people get caught. Now, generally what happens is people will be able to keep this up for some time. They might refinance a couple of times. They might draw down some equity from their property. But ultimately, this can be really concerning in terms of people's financial future, but also, as I said earlier on, it has the psychological issue as well. And the psychology of this is quite important, right? So people get to the point where they are unable to think their way out of it, and they get themselves into significant pressure. And that can even lead to, social issues and all those things. And, I use Mandra as an example, right? Because Mandra a few years ago was highly stressed. It's less stressed now, but highly stressed. There was a lot of social issues bubbling off the back of it. And that's the problem that I have. This can create considerable pressures for quite a few areas. And in fact, in some of my one-to-one conversations, I report on crime statistics, right? Because it's actually quite interesting and important to understand what the crime story is in a particular location. And there's a high correlation between high crime rates and social issues and financial pressure and mortgage stress. All those things are related. So that's why these maps are really quite powerful in terms of understanding what's going on. Okay, what else have we got? Thanks very much, Avdan, for that contribution. I really appreciate it. David Neal says, do you think all the people pushed towards building and buying their first home and lack of immigration could mean far less renters and people with investment property struggling? Well, at the moment, there's plenty of rental properties around, particularly in some of the more central areas, less out in the regions, as I was explaining. The demand for rental properties is not as strong as it was, and that's true particularly close into the centres of the city. A lot of students, of course, haven't come back from overseas. A lot of people who were working in the city aren't working in the city now at the moment, so they don't need to live in. And I did some work for in my one-on-one series for somebody who was quite close into Sydney and had a couple of student blocks of accommodation, and their vacancies were at 80%. So, that's the sort of the first story. And the other point is that property investors, quite a few, particularly those with high-rise property investments, when they do the calculation on their yields, they have a horror because they didn't realise just how much money they were losing hand over fist. And particularly if you've got high vacancy rates, then your investment is not functioning. And if you don't have an investment that works, you've got to get rid of it, right? And so we're seeing a lot of people with high-rise investments, particularly units, particularly close into the centres of the city, thinking, well, maybe I should sell. So expect more supply, more coming on. That, of course, could take out of the market a whole section of investment properties. And what we've had really over the last decade or two is the outsourcing of social housing and public housing into the private sector and just throwing people into the rental sector. The thing that's missing, in my view, is social housing. And unfortunately, the policies are just so weak. We should be doing something about that. And I also think there's probably a question about controlling rents and how people are actually encouraged to move on. So we're seeing quite a lot of rental evictions at the moment, people actually being asked to move, and then the rents are put up, and then they try and rent the property again. So in some cases, rents are actually rising quite strongly. So all of those things are in play. It's a pretty complex situation. Okay, Cyberchick said 4070. Yep, can do that. Let's just plumb the number in and I'll then show it to you. 4070. Okay, put that up. There we go. So we're looking at Bayo, Nudgee Beach, Virginia. 4,500 households there, 2,300 borrowing, 1,600 renting, 1,200 properties for rent, 1,250 investors, and 41% in financial stress. So again, reasonably high. Mild stress is 46% of households with mortgages, 1,054. The default rate's about 3%, which is about average, but slightly on the high side. 32% of rentals are actually in stress, so rental stress at 32% or 520, and 25% of stressed investors are up against it. No severe stress ones, but still a bit of a worry. Looking at price changes from now, over 3 years, best case scenario at 13%, 13.4, 4.8% if things don't go as well, or if they go bearish, then down 3% over 3 years. Units, 9%, 3%, and 2.6%, minus 2.6%. So that's the way it works. And, middle of the road, but, the financial stress, anything above 40 always flags to me considerable concern about what might be happening. Higher levels even more so. Okay, what else have we got? Let's come back to there. Interesting question about local councils' performance. How do local council performance affect house prices? For example, Central Coast and its massive debt. Yeah, there's definitely some significant variations. Now, of course, most councils benefit when there's developments underway. They charge development fees and land access fees and service fees and all sorts of things. So it's very much a nice little earner for most councils. Those councils that have higher debt levels often charge more. So the development cycle is more expensive. That means that the price of construction is more expensive. That means that prices are more expensive on properties that are built. In addition, of course, some of the local services are not up to scratch either, and we see it around here in this part of the world. The community services are really not as good as they probably should be, and that tends to be also a function of poor finances and bad debt. A lot of states, of course, have been issuing bonds. Some local councils have been issuing bonds as well. They were encouraged by the Reserve Bank so to do, but of course, it has to be paid back. And that's the thing about debt, right? I keep coming back to this more broadly. Debt has to be repaid. You can't just go on rolling it and rolling it and rolling it. Eventually, it comes home to roost. So, but there are definitely some differences. One of the things I always say to people when they're actually looking to buy in a particular area is it's good to look at the council, look at the finances of the council, look at the fees for things. And even things like council rates, they do vary considerably. And there is a bit of a correlation between high council rates and high debt. So again, something else to look at. Okay, let's have a look. What else? I'm going to do a couple more postcodes because I have some 4557 I was asked about before we started. So let me just put that one in the system. Okay, Mountain Creek. Here we go. Mooloomba. Okay, 4557, 8,700 households, 2,800 borrowing, 4,700 renting, 3,500 for rent, and 2,600 rental property owners, 42% in financial stress. So above 40%, slight concern. Rental stress is 41%, 1,900. Investor stress at 41%, at just over 1,000. But mortgage stress is quite low at 22% at 628. So this is more an investor-led problem rather than an owner-occupier-led problem. In terms of house price projections, well, just over 13% best case over 3 years from this point. In the neutral case, 4.7 over 3 years, down 3.5 over 3 years if things go pear-shaped. For units, 9.4, 3.4, and down 2.5 is what I'm seeing in my data. And you also asked about 4558, so let me just do that while I'm here. And I just want to highlight while I'm doing this that you can get access to this data. If you subscribe via Patreon, you can actually run these queries and other queries yourself to be able to get a view of what's going on and compare different postcodes and things like that. This is 4557 Mountain Creek, 8,000, hang on, I found that one, 4558. I want 4558. Okay, 4558 is Maroochydore, Sunshine Plaza. Yeah, some crazy stuff going on in some of these areas. Now, this is interesting. Financial stress, 63% here, 10,500 households, 2,300 borrowing, 5,900 renting, 4,500 properties for rent, and 2,900 property investors. 63% in financial stress, 70% in mortgage stress. So financial stress for mortgage holders quite high, 1,600. That's partly to do with the reliance on tourism, which of course has been badly hit by what's happened, plus a lot of small businesses struggling in the area. 61% of renters, 3,617, are in difficulty. 51% of investors are also in difficulty, with 141 in severe stress and 1,383 in stressed investor status. In other words, they've got issues with trying to let their property, or they're trying to sell it, or they've got vacancies that are very high. So quite a lot of concern, and of course, a bit different from the last one that we looked at. And you can see then that prices up 10% over the next 3 years, best case, up 1.4% neutral case, down 6.7% worst case. The units up 7.4%, pretty much 1%, and down 5% over 3 years. And I'll just do the last one that you asked for, which was 4560, which is, again, another sunshine. Oops, I will get this right. 4560. Come on. I need to select one. There you go. Select that one. Okay. Yep. Okay, so this is a lower stress one. So you can see it's slightly away from the coast. And generally what I find is that the ones on the coast have the most significant dynamics in terms of stress. As you come inland, it's a little easier. 13,400 households, 5,500 borrowing, so more have a mortgage, 5,200 renting, 3,900 properties for rent, 3,100 rental property owners, 32% in financial stress, 59% in mortgage stress at 3,200, with 156 in looking for default 3% over the next 12 months. But rental stress is pretty good, 10%, and investor stress at 14% is pretty good. So that's the story. It's a story of mortgage stress in this particular postcode. 13.8% over 3 years, 5.4 in the neutral case, or down 2.6% for houses, or for units, up 10%, 4%, or down 2%. So there you go. Hope that was helpful. All right, let's see what else is going on. How are we doing? 9:12. Oh, gosh, doesn't time fly when you're enjoying yourselves? Okay, Cookie Boy says, will the audience hit 400? I hope it will. It's not quite there, but, it's still not doing too badly. But can I ask, please, like the post. Please like the post. I'm always amazed how few people actually come on the show, watch the show, and then go off without liking it. Please do like it. It really does make a difference. It helps with the algorithm. It helps to get the show out there, and therefore more people see it later. So I would appreciate it if you could do that. Interestingly, the number in the live doesn't necessarily correlate to the number of people who watch it subsequent. So I always say, well, it depends on what other people are doing, right? When we had a complete lockdown across the country, we had much higher numbers because people were not out, whereas now they're still more out. And interestingly, even around Sydney, people are still out. I don't quite know how that works, but there you go. Patrick makes a very good point here. Why listen to the Reserve Bank? They've been wrong or slow off the mark. Rates going up is the time bomb that can't be diffused. I tend to agree with that. I was reading something the other day saying, well, you could probably put rates up by 1%, without too much difficulty. Above that, things really go badly. It goes badly for two reasons. One is that government debt goes up. And of course, in the long-term budgeting, they've actually assumed a higher rate for debt payments ahead because of that. But the other is that households themselves get into difficulty. Now, I do have in my models scenarios where I actually run with 0.5%, 1%, 1.5%, 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%. It's quite interesting running those. I might make a show on that, actually, thinking about it, because it changes the map, the stress map, and changes the default map quite significantly as rates go up. So what you see, first of all, is a greater concentration in the areas that are already stressed. But then the stress spreads and stretches, and it starts to touch other postcodes that at the moment are doing reasonably well. And I think the tipping point's about 1.5%. So if rates go more than 1.5% above where they are at the moment, that's enough to put significant numbers of people into financial flow difficulty. And just to recap again, financial flow difficulty means there's more money going out each month than coming in each month. Now, of course, you can tap into deposits and you can go onto credit cards, or you can use buy now, pay later. But if you don't change your behavior, ultimately you end up with effectively a problem, and that problem gets bigger and bigger. And then you try to refinance, and then you draw down more equity, and then you go on that for a bit. And then ultimately the bank says, you got to sell, mate. And we're seeing a lot of the you got to sell, mate questions coming up quite a lot. I've had quite a few one-on-one conversations with people who've been asked by their bank to seriously consider whether they should sell. Now, I don't give financial advice, but I can certainly talk about the particular property and the dynamics of the property in the area. People are quite shocked when the bank says, we think you should sell. So, they don't foreclose. The foreclosure is the very, very pointy bit of this. It's that broader thing where effectively people decide to sell, what I call distressed sales in the sort of the broad sense, rather than distressed sales in terms of being forced by the bank because they've been foreclosed. Different tenor completely. Okay, Vanessa asked, who trusts Governor Lowe? Yeah, I'm afraid that I don't have a lot of respect for central bankers generally, because they've got this really myopic view of the world. They've got this sort of mental model of how the economy works, which is actually not very real when it comes to real people. And in fact, he was asked some time ago, what about all these people who are relying on their savings and the rates have come way down? He said, well, I can try and explain why I've done it. We didn't answer the question, right? We've got a lot of people in financial flow difficulty because of low interest rates, because their investment strategies have been shot to pieces. And unfortunately, I don't think that he's actually really thinking about this holistically. None of the central bankers are. They're all thinking about it in too narrow terms. And of course, if you start from the assumption that we can't allow house prices to fall because if we did, then the banks would get into difficulty. And if the banks got into difficulty, we'd have a financial crisis, right? That's the sort of the line of logic. Then you do all you can to prop house prices up, which is low interest rates, reduce the lending standards, don't look too hard at the processes and systems within the banks, all of those things, and reduce responsible lending, just to make it a bit easier. That's the strategy. But as I said at the front, New Zealand defined as an economy where you've got effectively a property-based economy with a bit of other stuff bolted on the side. Well, that's where we are in Australia now. Too much of our property is in debt. Too many households are in debt. We don't have enough investment in the rest of the things that we need to make the economy work. And frankly, just inflating house prices forever and just getting people into more debt forever is futile. Remember what the BIS said about creating instability in the financial system? That's what they're doing. So no, I don't trust low at all. Rolf said, who would have thought the housing could have gone up 50% in the last 12 months? You should have watched my show. 12 months ago, I started talking about the scenario where prices were going to rise. And in fact, in my more aggressive scenario in terms of price rises, that number was there. So, it's not a total surprise to me. It's all about low interest rates, lending to the moon and all those things. So Michael asked, why does the RBA deflect from the real inflation rate in the economy and exclude rapid housing costs when assessing their version of inflation rate? Good question. It was done about 20 years ago. Most central banks around the world basically all decided what they would do is to use a rental proxy rather than, the argument was, well, you have such big movements in house prices up and down that it, makes the inflation number look really weird, right? And so what you should do is convert it into a rental proxy and use the rental proxy. In other words, the cost of housing, never mind whether you're renting or whether you're actually in an occupation. Unfortunately, what it does, it means the inflation rate's probably less by 1 to 1.5% than it probably should be at the moment, maybe even 2%. Now, of course, they can't go back because if they did, then it means they've actually exceeded their inflation target, which means they've got to lift interest rates to tame inflation, right? And that's the problem. They've built this sort of system that's taken them into this cul-de-sac, as I explained earlier. I don't think we're going to get that turned around. But pretty much everybody knows that actually in true terms, the real costs for real people are a lot higher. Unfortunately, the way that the CPI is calculated and reported is actually understating what's really going on, in my view. I discussed it with Edwin the other night, the cost of carrots and Granny Smiths, right? There's a more serious point, though. If, in fact, inflation is actually moving at a different trajectory to the one that the Reserve Bank thinks it is based on the official measure, then they're actually going to make policy decisions. And the thing I'm worried about is policy mistakes. I think the Reserve Bank has made a series of policy mistakes over the last 10 years or so. I think they're to blame for this. I think central bankers around the world should be actually held to task and held to account for their errors. But no. They're being protected by the political class. They're being protected by, the 1% who actually done very well out of all of this. And they are protecting the financial system. I mentioned those reverse repos. They're protecting those reverse repos. They're protecting the banks. They're protecting the financial stability because they believe that's their end state. I think that's completely wrong. And I remind you of what the Reserve Bank's mandate actually is, which is actually about, the welfare of real Australians. That's what they should be worrying about. Unfortunately, they've lost the plot. Sorry, I'll come off my high horse now, but I feel really strongly about this. This is a critical issue, not just here in Australia, but around the world. Central bankers should be held to account, but they don't. They aren't held to account. The politicians hardly ask them any hard questions. The press don't ask them any hard questions. Nobody asked about the exit strategy. Sorry, I find it very frustrating. All right. What else have we got? I'm going to look down the list. There's a few conversations I'm not going to get into. Patrick says 2251 Central Coast has cooled. Yeah, we're seeing that actually around the place. I'm seeing significant pendulum swings now in a lot of areas where for a period of time houses and land particularly were going quickly. There's a lot more negotiating happening now, in some cases before auctions, and people are more willing now to sell before auctions. And we're also seeing some of the differences in terms of stock. So I expect to see significant stock rises coming on into the spring season, which is not far away now. So we may well have peaked. We'll see. And it's interesting that some of the earlier indicators are also suggesting mortgage momentum is also easing as well. So some of the forward indicators from CoreLogic on mortgage flows are beginning to come off. And interestingly, the rate of change of growth of mortgage lending is coming off a little bit as well. Investors are coming on a little bit. First-time buyers are coming off a little bit. So it's marginal, but I think we may well be seeing the next sort of easing out. Will be varying by locations and states and all those things. Quickie Boy says, Reserve Bank won't raise, they need a lower dollar. Problem is, lower dollar equals higher imported inflation. Correct. That's exactly the point. So on one hand, it would be quite good to be able to actually take the dollar lower and make ourselves more competitive. But, there are consequences of doing that. And that's the problem. They've boxed themselves into this corner. I absolutely agree with you. Bondi Steve says, M&A in overdrive and certain retail offerings being ended. Rampant deflation. Yeah, well, there's, I still hold the view. Whatever else I've seen, I still think that there are significant deflationary factors in this. And, as Steve Van Meter would say, got to understand all this quantitative easing is deflationary. Low interest rates are deflationary, right? And sure, there are some spikes of inflation around the place, but is it really structural inflation? And I suspect that we're going to see, a deflationary spiral. Stagflation, perhaps, I don't know. But yeah, this is definitely worth watching. And, it's interesting how the expectations of really high inflation that were being spoken about by 1 or 2 months ago by a lot of people saying, buy gold, that's all sort of gone away a bit. More people are now swallowing the idea of this being more tactical inflation, temporary inflation, the base effect, as I've explained on a few occasions, which means that the deflationary side of the argument maybe has more legs. So that tends to be where I sort of tend to veer when I think about some of these things. Vincent asks, which scenario is playing out now? So at the moment, the probability, so the way I do it is run the different scenarios and then I basically say, let's look at the probabilities. The probability is still slightly ahead. In other words, the vaccine rollouts will get fixed over the next few months. The borders will reopen next year, right? Now that's the scenario that's playing out at the moment. It's not as strong as the Reserve Bank scenario, but it's still quite strong. So that's the one I plug into my modelling when I look at the 3 different scenarios. But as I said earlier on, it could tilt. And if it moves a bit further from where it is, we could actually see the middle scenario, which is effectively a series of short lockdowns and, the sort of pain we've been seeing continuing. And if it continues, then, as I showed you, confidence erodes, retail gets under pressure, some of the other business sector gets under pressure. So it could then be enough to tip some of this into that sort of, mid scenario, which then would suggest that prices could go sideways or down. Of course, the Reserve Bank will then cut rates and try and swing it back up again. But at the moment, we're just in that more positive scenario, but only just. So Debt and Regret says, we'll have 2% deposit guarantees and super withdrawals in the future to keep the housing market afloat. Probably right. You're right. Yeah. The banks and, of course, the governments will do everything they can to keep the housing market intact, to keep the loan-to-value ratios looking smooth, and to keep the default rates very low. That is the base assumption. So you assume possibly that they will do a lot more in terms of further stimulus, more pulling down of super, more super guarantees, etc., etc. And of course, Michael Zucker was spruiking it over the last few weeks about how this is great for those people wanting to get into the market. Well, it might be. But if the consequence is big debt, which is hard to manage later, and more high house prices, is that really good? I remember what you said about what the BIS said. Got to be careful with this. And what Phil Lowe said, you don't want house prices to move faster than the rate of wage growth. Spot on. We've already got very high debt. So yeah, the dangers is you distort the economy even more. There's less investment then into the other productive parts of the economy, which is what we need to be able to make this all work. And on it goes. So unfortunately, that's sort of where it ends up if we're not very careful. Okay, well, we're coming up towards the end of the show. Regis asked this question. What do you make of RBA statements about worried about lending outstripping wage growth too much? Haven't wages been outstripped by lending for 10 years? Spot on. That's the whole point, right? So on one hand, Phil Lowe says he's worried about the amount of household debt and you can't let this get out of hand. What's he done over the last few years? Let the debt get out of hand relative to incomes. I've been saying for many years the problem we have is that we're too leveraged. If the banks had more sensible lending policies and didn't have multiples, as it were, we wouldn't have the problem we got. Housing would then be more affordable. People could actually have more money. And if they had more money, they could spend more. So in fact, believe it or not, lower house prices could lead to a more productive economy, a more balanced economy, more people owning their house price, owning their houses. And remember this, we've got a smaller proportion of people owning their own house today than we've ever had. So the policy has failed. It has failed in terms of allowing more people to own property. You've got more people with more debt, and you've got more people having to rent. So this is a failure on every level. Crazy, crazy. Big question on land. Yeah, land cycles are quite interesting. A lot of people are land banking at the moment. If you talk to some of the bigger land companies, they're holding land saying, it'll be fine. Give it a few years, we'll make a lot of money one way or the other. But there is going to be a bit of cyclical to this, as you say. I think the next few years could be quite interesting ahead. Okay, we're running up on showtime, but I will just do this one for Essendon, as I'm being asked to look at Essendon. Whoops, let me just go there. 3040. 3040. Okay. Essendon. Get up. Yep, here we go. This is 3040. So there are 11,199 households, 3,600 borrowing, 5,100 renting, 3,900 for rent, and 3,400 investors, 69% in financial stress. A very high number. That could be the record today, couldn't it? 100% of mortgage stress. What? That's pretty bad. A lot in severe stress. So there's a real financial pressure point here, clearly. Rental stress, quite high at 41%. Investor stress at 40%. So yeah, a lot of issues. And look, the modelling is looking at maybe growth of 5% over 3 years. Best case, a fall over 3 years of 3% or 11% if things go badly for houses. 4.1, -2, -8. So this is a postcode where there's a lot of pressure. And of course, it's partly the lockdowns. It's partly the employment prospects in the area and the income. But this is a good example of a really, really significantly stressed postcode. Okay, well, now let me just go here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to finish off just going to the end of the show, and then I might do a couple more postcodes if there's time, and if you've got appetite to do that. But let me just go back over here, and I'm just going to pick up my presentation, which is there, and then come back to... Okay, so just to complete the story in terms of the show, the postcode tool is now available. If you want to get the same information as I've shown tonight, you can have access to it. Just simply go across to Patreon. The Patreon program is got various levels to it, but there's a $50 a month plus GST. That gives you access to the stress and all the scenarios and everything. We have a number of people who get that notified every month. If you're in the Patreon program at this level, we'll be sending out the updated links and things tomorrow, and then you can model it to your own heart's content. You can also download subsets and all sorts of exciting things in the in the tool there. So that's via the Patreon program. The Patreon link is there at the bottom of the screen, and you can also go to the website or to the DFA blog and find it from there as well. In terms of more information, there's the walktheworld.com.au website, which is the one where I essentially talk about the services we work with Nucleus Wealth on the whole investment side of things, with the super fund and with the investment funds. The DFA blog contains more data. All of our posts are on the DFA blog. And if for any reason YouTube ever took me off, you could go to the digitalfinanceanalytics.com blog. Everything is there. I've mentioned Patreon. You feel free to support us at various levels. We do have people supporting at different levels, getting access to different levels of special content. And I'll also make the point that you can, if you feel so inclined, make a one-off contribution via PayPal. That's the link down there. People do that from time to time. Thank you very much if you've done that. Or indeed via Bitcoin if you want to use a QR code. There is Merc as well, which some people have got. So just go to the DFA site, or there's the link direct. And next week, Chris Bates, the mortgage broker from Sydney, is on. We're going to talk about what's happened with the property market, the mortgage market, and all those things. Be interesting conversation, of course. Great time to have a conversation with Chris, given the Reserve Bank and the tightening of mortgage standards and those sorts of things. So that'll be worth having a look at. And with that, I'm just going to have a quick look through for any last comments or questions. Just also recognise AI. Thank you very much for your contribution. I missed that in the in the earlier show. Let me just pick that up. Hang on. It's very funny. Thank you, Jason. I really appreciate that contribution. It's yeah, go higher. That's fine. Always happy. And also from Jason again, Australia may be stressed due to the lockdowns. Please follow health advice. Only way out of this is vaccination. Please do it, people. We need to make COVID the average flu, but that takes vaccinations. Nigel. Yep. Well, there are a lot of people preaching the gospel. There are also a lot of people not totally convinced, I have to say, with what's going on, but that's a whole other story, which I'm not going to touch on tonight, but thanks for that. And also, Jeff makes the point, housing selling very quickly in Ipswich, Queensland. A real estate agent told me he sold 3 in 1 week to people from Sydney. How is race view 4305? Okay, there you go. So let me just come back to that, and I'll try and give you an answer to 4305. Hang on a moment. Let me just go there. 4305. 4305. Yeah, there we go. 4305. Okay. Just going to put this one up now, and I'll get rid of that off the screen. Thanks for your contribution also, Jeff. Appreciate that. Okay, 4305, 25,000 households, 9,000 borrowing, 12,000 renting, 9,900 for rent, 5,600 rental property owners, 57% in stress, 64% in mortgage stress, so that's quite high at 5,800, 2% in default, 55% in rental stress, 7,000, 28% in investor stress. So this is a combination of a combination of mortgage stress and rental stress. That's to do with low incomes, pressed incomes, all of those things. And of course, there's been quite a lot of pressure in this particular area. In terms of prices, 11% over 3 years, best case for houses, for units, 8%, mid case 2.8 versus 2, and down 5.4 over 3 years, worst case scenario, or down 4 for units. So there you are. Okay, so I think I am done for the night. Thank you very much indeed for spending so much of your time with me. I hope you found that interesting. I will just make the point, and this is quite important, that if you do have issues with financial stress, mortgage stress, etc., it's very important not just to sort of put your head on the ground and hope it'll go away, right? Because given the flat incomes, the rising cost pressures, and the perspective of rising interest rates later, it's really important to get your head around it. So one of the things that I suggest is that people drop a cash flow. You can go to ASIC and get from the Smart Money website some really good tools to be able to drop cash flows, so you can see your money coming in, money coming out, and then you make some prioritize decisions. And also, if you are in financial stress with a mortgage, talk to the bank. They do have a legal obligation to help through their hardship schemes. And the sooner you get in touch, the sooner you engage with them, the more likely you are to be able to actually manage your way through this. Because in the current environment, I don't personally think that there is a simple exit. In the early 2000s, we had very strong wages growth. Even the Reserve Bank today said, don't expect wages growth to be strong in the next 3 to 4 years. So don't expect a get out of jail card relating to wages growth. So just a sort of passing message from me. And with that, let me just have one last quick look down the final comments, see whether there's anything else that I've missed. I think I probably have. And if you didn't get an answer to my postcode question, send me a message via the DFA blog and I can send it to you later. And other than that, I think we're pretty much done. Peter said, those in financial stress are totally screwed. Well, they've got to wake up and smell the roses first, right? Right. The first point is to know where you are. A lot of people don't know where they are. Then there are things that you can potentially do after that. So that's what I would basically think about. And in terms of debt-free here, I only watch because Martin's a good man. Thank you. Well, I'm debt-free here. I've been debt-free for a long time, and it's a good feeling. John Adams and I hopefully get together sometime soon. We've got issues with the lockdowns, but hopefully we'll come back. And Rolf said, beer tax? No beer tax. Okay. Rolf said, inflation can't be stopped. No, that's not true. Why do you say that? I don't quite know. If I missed a comment of yours, I apologise. If I have, my apologies. Let me just go back and see whether I can find it. There you go. 4070. All right. I'll do 4070. Cyberchick. There you go. How's that? Don't say I don't do anything. This is Muggill and Pryor's Pocket. There you go. Now, just understand that there are lots and lots of comments in the chat, and sometimes I don't necessarily see every single one. Okay, here we go. There we go. 4070, 4,000 households, 2,500 borrowing, 1,000 renting, 765 properties for rent, 1,200 investors, 49% in financial stress, 50% in mortgage stress, 1,250, 3% in default, 67, 50% in rental stress, 512, 18% in investor stress. So look, this is again cash flow issues. This is about day-to-day, jobs and money and those sorts of things, rather than the investment side. And 12% over 3 years, best case scenario for houses, or 9% for units. 4% neutral case compared with 2.9% for units, or down 4% compared with down 3.1% for units in the worst case scenario. So there you go. Hopefully that proves that I do take note of what people say and do try to respond. And Smooth Operator, good to see you on. Cookie Boy says 211 likes. Keep going with the likes, guys. And Smooth Operator, hope your finger's okay there. Yeah. I know. Got there. Okay. So that's it. We're done. And we come back to the main screen. Thank you very much for spending some time with me this evening. Hope you found it useful. Keep watching the shows. Please keep liking the shows and sharing the shows. It's really important we try and get some of these messages out. And don't forget, Chris Bates will be on next week to talk about property and specifically, what's happened with mortgage broking, which I think in the current environment will be a very interesting and important show. Turn the Locantro the week after. So look forward to seeing you next time. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Thanks for watching. See you again.